Welcome to Chaotic Healing with Jaden Auburn. I'm Jaden Auburn, your host and the founder of Tice Consulting and Therapy and co-founder of Chaotic Healing. I am a Black, Indigenous, queer, non-binary, ethically non-monogamous, kinky healer that offers psychotherapy, personal training, nutrition counseling, holistic health coaching, and consulting. I am here to give you a fresh new perspective on healing that is kind of chaotic, but also kind of fun. So, welcome to the journey. Lego. Welcome back. I'm so excited for this episode because we are going to be talking about boundaries, why they're important, what they are, common misconceptions, and how to effectively implement them in your life. Now, I'm super excited about this conversation because I am a big fan of boundaries. I like to say that I have Jadenisms. They're just like phrases that I say a lot. And my very first Jadenism that I ever developed was boundaries are love. But before we can get into the nitty gritty of it all, why are boundaries important? Boundaries are love, not only for yourself, but for others as well. It's so interesting because when we think about setting boundaries, people are generally like, yeah, that's good, awesome, blah, 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 blah. But we don't really understand why that's good. And furthermore, a lot of times when you start poking at people about why they don't want to set boundaries, it often comes down to feeling that setting a boundary is bad, that it makes them selfish, which is so interesting to me because we set all sorts of boundaries in our lives and it's not considered selfish. If a lactose intolerant person sets a boundary that they're not going to have any dairy, we're not like, oh, you're so selfish. How dare you not destroy your gastrointestinal tract and try my mac and cheese right now? But then all of a sudden, when we're setting boundaries in an interpersonal setting, then people are like, oh my gosh, I'm being so selfish. And I have a whole nother rant soapbox that will probably be its own episode at some point about selfishness and that we're all innately narcissistic and that's okay. Selfishness, like anything else, can be helpful or it can be harmful, but it's not inherently good or bad. Anyways, back to boundaries. If you start effectively setting boundaries, change happens and that can be super scary. There might be some loss and some grief, but overall, typically it helps you move towards a more value aligned life. And so when I think of boundaries or love for yourself, what really comes to mind is this little metaphor. So imagine we are in a medieval town and you are the ruler of this town living in a castle. And then one of your advisors comes up to you and says, hey, we got this new technology that will let us know if anyone is plotting to overthrow you. Like people's thoughts, they're putting out certain wavelengths. And if the wavelengths are in this range, it lets us know that they're trying to overthrow you. And you can make it so as soon as their brain goes into this wavelength, all of their hair will fall out. Now, this is useful technology if you're a ruler in this castle, because the people who are actively trying to harm you can be identified before bad shit happens. And then you can decide what you want to do with those people to make sure they can't harm you. But y'all out here not wanting to set boundaries because you're like, oh, what if my good friend ends up being the one who's plotting to overthrow and kill me? And then they lose all their hair. And I know they're going to hate being bald. And, I'd just be so selfish. It'd be so selfish of me to make them bald because they're thinking about overthrowing me and killing me. Nope, I'm not going to use that technology. I'll just go ahead and like have the risk of being overthrown. Like, what? What is that? Absolute nonsense. So clearly, boundaries are good for you. And boundaries are a way to express love for others. And this one can be really difficult for people to realize because maybe you've encountered someone who has misused boundaries in the past. Maybe you have only really experienced people setting boundaries, when they're trying to be mean or to punish you. And while people can use boundaries to do that, again, anything can be used in a helpful or harmful way. Really, boundaries are an act of love for another person. When you're setting a boundary for someone, you're saying, I want to be closer with you, or at least I want to maintain our relationship. And in order to do that, I need things to change. So, for example, I use they, them pronouns. And if I go to the grocery store and someone genders me in any sort of way, I'm probably not going to say anything about it. It's probably not going to be worth it for me to explain to this person that I probably won't ever see again that they did not accurately identify my gender. However, if it's someone I'm meeting that seems really cool and we're hanging out and we're really vibing and they're misgendering me, well, then I might be like, hey, just so you know, I use they, them pronouns because I don't want to regularly hang out with someone who's misgendering me. So I'm going to engage in the discomfort of being like, please use my correct pronouns. And then ideally, they'll engage with the discomfort of, oopsies, didn't realize that I was misgendering you. And also now I need to remember to use your correct pronouns. And if that happens, then we can continue growing closer together. Now, if they were to decide, I don't give a fuck about your pronouns, I'll gender you however the fuck I want, well, we're probably not going to be as close. So, really identifying boundaries as a way to become closer to people, to say, I am committed to developing and continuing a relationship with you, and this is how we can do that. And it's also kind of a test to see if the other person shares that same commitment and they want to move closer in relationship with you as well. And if they do, they'll respect your boundaries. And we do this sort of stuff all the time. You ever get a new partner and you're like, hey, this is what I like in bed. This is how I want you to kiss me. This is how I want you to have sex with me. Why do you do that? So you can have better sex, so you can have better kisses, and so you can have a better romantic and more erotic relationship. I also recognize some people don't do that. And if you're one of those people, here's your permission to go ahead and tell your partner what you want. You will be happier afterwards, and they will probably also be happier afterwards because seeing someone you're attracted to be in pleasure is like, oh my gosh, right? Okay, moving on. So, boundaries are love for others as well as yourself. When we don't set boundaries, we often can cause more harm. Imagine having a long day at work and you're just so tired, just like emotionally exhausted. You're like, I want to smoke this J, binge my Netflix, and it's going to be one of those nights. I just need my alone time and to decompress. And then your homie calls you up and they're like, hey, I could really use some emotional support right now. Can I come over? You could say yes, but if you don't actually have the emotional capacity to support them, at best, your friend is not going to get their needs met. And at worst, you're feeling resentful and irritated, and your friend is picking up on that. They came over to your house to feel better. And now they're leaving feeling even worse because they had to deal with your irritable, resentful energy. And after all that, they don't trust you. If your friends can't trust that you'll be honest with them when they ask you if you have emotional capacity, they're probably going to stop asking you because they can't trust your answer. So the next time your friend is in distress and you do have capacity to help them, they're not going to come to you because last time they tried that, they left feeling worse, which means there's going to be limits to how close y'all can get. Again, boundaries are a way to continue and develop relationships. It truly is an act of love whenever you set them. So, now that we all understand why it's so important to set the boundaries, how do you do that? What are boundaries even? And I really do want to talk about this because it seems that due to misinformation on the interwebs, people have confused boundaries with requests. So let me break it down and be super clear for y'all. Boundaries are your response to something. They are what you will do. A lot of times when I'm working with people and we're discussing boundaries, they'll say, oh, this person disrespected my boundaries. And I'll ask, well, what is your boundary? And they'll say, I told them I don't want them to make comments about my body. Cool. That's not a boundary, though. That's an ask. You requested for them to not talk about your body, and they have declined that request. A boundary has to have a consequence. If there's no consequence, it's not a boundary. The boundary is if you talk about my body, I will end the conversation, right? That's the boundary, you ending the conversation. If this thing happens, then I will do this. Now, there's some pros and cons to this. The pros are that you are solely in charge of maintaining your boundaries. You don't have to rely on anyone else or anyone else's mood or anything like that. Like you are completely capable and responsible for setting and maintaining your own boundaries. The cons are that you are completely and solely responsible for setting and maintaining your own boundaries. You can't put it off on anyone else. And I've seen increasingly over the years people say, well, I can't set boundaries because they'll respond in this way. Their response actually has nothing to do with your ability to set the boundary. Now, if you are navigating power differentials, physical violence, people having control over your finances, you may decide not to set a boundary because of those reasons. But in general, a boundary is your response to something. And this is difficult because you have to decide what you're willing to do, what you're willing to lose, what you're willing to give up. It really sucks to have to set a boundary with someone and then implement it. Like it does not feel great. So, going back to my earlier analogy, if I met this person who was super, super cool and I was so excited to get to know them, and then they're just someone who will not respect my pronouns no matter how many times I ask, then the boundary will likely sound like I'm not going to be friends with them. And that sucks because I was excited about that friendship. I have a lot of disappointment with that, some grief, maybe some anger. There's a lot of uncomfortable feelings that I might feel in that situation. Boundary settings are not fun. I feel like sometimes people want to portray it as like, oh, yeah, I set a boundary and I feel so empowered and great and amazing. And you know what? If that's your experience, I'm happy for you. And I don't think that that is the most common experience in setting boundaries. It's really often not that fun to set boundaries. It can be very emotionally distressing and difficult, and we still do it. We do hard things because there's a benefit to them. Something that is important to know when you're setting boundaries is that a pretty reasonable and common reaction is for someone to escalate or to test your boundary. We see this all the time with children. And we always think we're so much better than children as adults. We're not. Like we do a lot of the same stuff. If you have a kiddo and they do some dumb shit, you might say, hey, if you don't stop doing that dumb shit, you're not going to get to watch any TV tonight. And then they continue to do the dumb shit and then they don't get to watch TV. And then they might throw a whole ass temper tantrum. And it sucks because then as a parent, you have to deal with the temper tantrum. No one's really happy about this. But we all know those children, those kids who did not have boundaries maintained for them as a child. Yeah, they grow up to be real annoying adults. So it's still really important to set the boundaries with your children, even though it's uncomfortable. There's a story of me when I was a very, very small child. I don't actually remember this because I was so young, but it's family lore. And my parents told me not to go out into the street because, you don't want your child to wander into the street. So I stood right on the edge of the curb and put one single toe in the street just because I was testing the boundary. How far can you test the boundary? I did get in trouble after that, if you were wondering. But yeah, we do the same things as adults, maybe unintentionally, maybe intentionally, but we still do those things. right? It's natural for us to want to test and push boundaries. If you know you have to be at work at 9 and then, oh no, you're running late, and then you get to work at 9:05 and your boss is like, it's totally fine, not a big deal. Well, whether you're consciously realizing this or not, your new work time just became 9:05, right? Like the next time you are running late to work, you're not going to be nearly as stressed out about it because you know that it's okay. Well, if 9:05 is fine, I'm sure 9:08 probably won't be a big deal. Yeah. And then you walk in at 9:08, not a big deal. Cool. 9:08 is now your new start time. Well, then maybe another time you come in at 9:15. And then your boss is like, hey, I noticed that you're a bit late today. Okay. 9:08 is still the start time. 9:15, that's too late. You will probably be at work before 9:15 most days because you now know that when you're there at 9:08, everything's fine. But if you wait until 9:15, the boss starts to notice and has something to say. So this is one way as adults that we push boundaries. Again, a lot of times pushing boundaries is not an intentional thing. And that's why it's so important for you as the person setting the boundary to be consistent about maintaining them. It's not like, oh, I set a boundary and it's there forever. Yay, my work is done. Like, no. Once someone crosses the boundary, you still have to do the thing. If you keep coming late to work, the boss's boundary might be to have a talk with you, then a verbal warning, then a written warning, right? We understand how these things progress in that type of situation. Even with the lactose intolerance example I used earlier, that's your body's boundary with you. So you can have a little bit of cheese and you might be just a little bit gassy. Eat a little bit more cheese and now you're feeling a bit bloated. Eat a little bit more and now you have diarrhea, right? The body's boundary with you is, hey, if you eat cheese, I'm going to be unhappy in these various ways. And both of y'all, you and the body, have to figure out how to navigate that together. So, like a lot of things in healing, the short term sucks, but the long term benefits are amazing. If you can learn to tolerate the short term discomfort of setting boundaries, having difficult conversations, and enforcing the boundaries, you have the long term benefits of stronger, healthier, deeper, more trusting relationships. You have more inner peace in your life. You'll probably have more capacity to do the things that you like. I know as a therapist, I have to set a lot of boundaries about how many clients I will see in one day and what hours I will see them. Because if I see too many clients in a day, then I can't do anything else. Like if I want to work out, if I want to draw, if I want to read, be social, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to do any of those things that make me happy because I've just spent all of my energy providing therapy. So I set a boundary on how many clients I will see in a day, so I do have energy after work. If a client were to ask, hey, can I see you on this day and time that's not my typical working schedule? That's not them disrespecting my boundaries. That's them making a request that I'm then going to decline. And I am responsible for holding that boundary. Now, there is some nuance in setting boundaries. It's not just, I'm setting a boundary and I'm going to be super rigid and I would never consider the circumstances ever, right? Like we've all had those really strict people in our lives that don't allow for any wiggle room based off of context. And that's not always helpful either. I had a client once who witnessed their partner get into a really, really bad accident on the freeway. And that client was in complete distress. I was very busy that day, but based off of the relationship I had with that client, I felt that it was going to be more helpful than harmful for me to at least call for 15 minutes. I didn't have time for a whole session, but I was going to make time for them in some way to show up for them because that was really important for me and how I like to show up as a therapist and also my relationship with that specific client. If your friend calls you saying, I need some emotional support after your long workday, you can say, hey, I don't have a lot of energy to emotionally support you, but you can be in the space with me. Maybe we can veg out together. So there are opportunities here for negotiation and compromise and for you to decide, okay, this is generally a boundary of mine, but in this one instance, I'm going to waive it. I do this with my late cancellation fee. I had a client come in recently who had strep throat. They came in looking like death, straight up death. And they're like, yeah, I have strep throat. I just got diagnosed this morning, picked up the meds. I was hoping to feel better today. Essentially, they had wished that they had canceled earlier, but they thought that they were going to be feeling better by today, but alas, they were not. Okay, well, I'm not going to charge you a late cancellation fee for that. Like, I've had strep throat. I know how painful that is. To do talk therapy for a whole hour with strep throat, absolutely not. Right? What kind of emotional processing are we going to do anyways? That's not how I want to spend my hour. And I'm always talking about taking care of yourself and honoring your body. What I look like charging someone for a late cancellation when they have actual strep throat. So, there are times where you can say, I am making an exception. I know, and my client knows that this is not a green light to go and just cancel on me all the time, right? This is an exception. And I also trust them. We've been working together for years. They understand and respect my cancellation policy. And in this instance, because there's extenuating circumstances, I can be flexible. So, all that to say, in my job, I'm all about boundaries or love. Set the boundaries, maintain the boundaries. And we also want to do that intentionally because anything without intention can have the ability to be harmful. So, your homework for the day is to consider where you're already setting boundaries in your life and where you're already negotiating boundaries. And I actually want you to start super, super easy and simple with things that maybe you didn't realize are boundaries that you currently set because we're all setting boundaries all of the time. So a boundary you might have is when I can feel that my bladder is full, I'm going to go pee. That might just be like a normal boundary for you and your body. But maybe sometimes when you feel the urge to pee, you're in the middle of a really interesting episode. So you're going to say, let me negotiate this boundary. And after this episode, I'm going to get up and pee. Or maybe you're feeling a little overwhelmed by the state of the world. And so you say, you know what? I need to unplug. I'm just not going to be on social media today. But then you end up negotiating that boundary because someone sent you a TikTok of cats being cute. And you're like, okay, well, I can hop on just to see this particular cat TikTok. But as soon as the TikTok is over, I want to get back off because I still don't want to see all of this other content, right? So that's a way to negotiate that boundary with yourself. I think there's a potential for boundaries to feel really big and scary. And so I really want to challenge that. You set boundaries with yourself and with others all day long. And you're not currently necessarily identifying those things as big and scary. So why do all the other boundaries need to feel that way? Some boundaries truly are big and scary, and that's fine. But how can we change our automatic association with boundaries away from being big and scary and more towards a neutral space? So that way, when we hear boundaries, we think neutrality. And then we can look at the situation and say, oh, yeah, this is a chill boundary or this is a big and scary boundary, but kind of removing some of that immediate emotional intensity from the word itself. All right. Well, I hope it's helpful. Let me know if you end up practicing this, and I will chat with you next time. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate the show, and share it with a friend. And if you would like to support this podcast even further while learning fun tools of chaotic healing, you can join our Patreon for as little as $5 a month. You can also purchase fun and provocative t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and stickers over on our Etsy shop. Don't forget to follow me on IG and Facebook for tons of free content to stay connected and just say hello. You'll find all those links below in the show notes. The theme music was created by Hyperius Blake, and Rio Horcasitas Auburn helped with visuals and production. Above all else, thank you for being on the journey with me, and I'll chat with you next time.